In 1887, the New York World newspaper laughed off Elizabeth Cochrane's dreams of being a reporter, just like that. They said ladies couldn't be journalists, but that couldn't stop the journalist known to history as Nellie Bly. We'll meet a novelist who wove Nellie's fact into fiction next.
It was strange. Here I was among all those people, and at the same time, I felt as if I were looking at them from someplace far away. The whole place seemed to me like a deep hole, and the people down in it like strange animals, like snakes. And I'd been thrown into it. Yes, as though I were in a snake pit.
Hello, history lovers, and welcome back. I'm your host, Dean Carianis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio. We are now number one in podcasting, and that's thanks to loyal listeners like you checking out shows on iHeart, or even talking to your Amazon Alexa and just asking her, for example, to play the latest episode of the History Author Show. You can find me at historyauthor.com or at HistoryDean on Twitter. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. This week's novel really lends itself to Instagram because there are so many amazing old pictures of the Blackwell's Island Asylum in the East River between Manhattan and Brooklyn. You just heard a clip of Olivia de Havilland from 1949's The Snake Pit, a film based on a true story written by Mary Jane Ward. Like the woman who we'll meet today, Mary Jane Ward hoped that her expose would shine a light on the horrors suffered by those condemned for insanity, held against their will and really with no hope of escape or ever rejoining a normal life. Yes, in this episode, our time machine travels back to the closest thing Gilded Age Gotham had to hell. Not Arkham Asylum, but the asylums of Blackwell's Island. You could get sent to that horrible place for almost anything. Being out late at night, being poor, or say you had a few too many drinks at McSorley's Old Ale House and you stumbled into a policeman. What if you didn't speak the language? All these things could get you sent to Blackwell's Island. And let me tell you, as somebody who's grown up with people speaking Greek as their first language, if you heard two Greek people talking to each other, you'd probably think that they were about to come to blows. But we're just very loud and expressive the way that we speak Greek, and some of that carries over to English speaking too. I can attest to that. So when you hear how horrible Blackwell's was, you wonder who in the world would choose to get committed there. The answer is a woman who called herself Nellie Bly. She took that name from an 1850s song that you're hearing in the background right now. So it's kind of like if you needed a pen name today and you decided to call yourself Jenny and tell people to call you at 876-5309. But in the century and a half since, the name Elizabeth Cochrane has all but disappeared from our minds, but we still hear about Nellie Bly. She's the heroine of today's author, Tanya Mitchell. She brings us the meticulously researched, fictionalized account of that mission. It's titled A Feigned Madness. Tanya's novel follows Nellie's quest to expose corrupt officials running the asylum without blowing her cover. Think about the things policemen deal with when they're undercover, or people investigating terrorist cells. You're going to witness some pretty terrible things and have to bite your tongue in order to serve your greater good. Well, that's Nellie's position. If she succeeds, she not only helps a lot of people who have been forgotten by her society, but she'll lock down her dream job as a reporter for the New York World. Failure will also mean that she's confirming the stereotype, the conventional wisdom, that women just can't hack it in a newsroom. You've seen Tanya Mitchell's award-winning fiction in the Copperfield Review, Words Undone, and the Front Porch Review, as well as various anthologies. She earned a BA from Indiana University in the field Nellie Bly pioneered, journalism. And she describes herself as obsessed with the Victorian Era, as we'll see in the rich transportive detail of her fiction. Visit her at TanyaMitchellAuthor.com or find her on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Okay, now that we're up to speed on the horrible conditions lurking behind these stone walls on Blackwell's Island, Let's join Tanya Mitchell and meet the intrepid Nellie Bly as she goes undercover in A Feigned Madness.
I remembered once reading in a book that long ago they used to put insane people into pits full of snakes. I think they figured that something which might drive a normal person insane might shock an insane person back into sanity. Well, it was just as though they'd thrown me into a snake pit. And I was shocked into thinking that maybe I wasn't as sick as the others, that I really might get well.
I'm joined via Skype by Tanya Mitchell, author of the novel A Feigned Madness. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with the History Author Show, Tanya.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you asked me to be here.
Well, people don't know just what an effort it was for us to get all of this going. We had some ghosts in the machine, as they say, but you persisted. And as an author, you clearly have to persist to write the novel. But also, it seemed very fitting for Nellie Bly, somebody who didn't take no for an answer, somebody who saw injustices and said, hey, I can fight the system. They have that old thing about who can fight City Hall. Well, Nellie Bly is the answer to that question in this Gilded Age period, right?
Right.
You include some remarks from her voluminous writing in A Feigned Madness, and one is the quote, "The insane asylum on Blackwell's Island is a human rat trap. It is easy to get in, but once there, it is impossible to get out." That draws people in right away. This is the sign of what a good journalist she was and what a good storyteller. But I wanted to know right off the bat how she hooks you. How does this real woman who chooses to go undercover in one of the worst places on earth catch your attention, and how closely does your fictional account follow her real life investigation?
So when we meet Nellie at the beginning of the novel, she's desperate for a reporting job at one of New York City's big papers. She's been in New York since the spring, so about 4 months, and she's been looking for work. In the meantime, she's been paying the bills by doing some correspondence reporting for the newspaper back where she got her start in Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh Dispatch. The problem is her funds are dwindling because New York is expensive. And none of the New York papers want to hire her because she's a woman. So she's in a pretty tight spot already. And it all really comes to a head when the day before the opening of the book, she mistakenly leaves her purse on one of the elevated trains. Unfortunately, it's got the last of her funds in it. So she's now essentially broke. And she's not only supporting herself, she's also supporting her mother. So when she shows up at the office of the New York World, again, asking for a job, she's now more desperate than ever. She doesn't want to go back to Pittsburgh because she thinks it'll look like defeat. She wants to stay in New York. All of what I just described really did happen. There was so much about her story that was just full of stuff like this to put in the novel, including some flashbacks I put in about her earlier life that depict some really bad things that happened to her starting at a really young age that really molded her into the tenacious, bold woman that she became. I did take some creative license in some areas, but I've always believed that if you stay true to the nature of the character or the characters that you're writing about, and if you're honest in the author's note about where you've deviated from the record and why, you're fine. That way, you've let the reader know what's historical, in the historical fiction and what's fiction in the historical fiction.
You speak about the real history of Nellie Bly, and she's the kind of figure that really hooks you with her daring exploits or anecdotes like you just mentioned, something that you read and you say, that seems just impossible. And here you're going to write a book about her adventures and things like that. That seems so perfect that she runs out of all her money. If she was completely fictional and you just based your book on Nellie Bly, that would be just good writing, where you take everything away from your character and put them in this horrible situation where she's poor and unable to get a job in the New York City of 1887. That would be a great place to start her. And yet it's something from her real life.
Yeah. All these unbelievable things that happened, and you would think, no way that really happened to her. And they did. And there were so many of those. And they didn't belong in the book because they were either out of the frame of the story itself or they happened, 10 years later or whatever. I actually decided after I wrote a couple blogs about her, I did 3 blogs. It was part 1, part 2, part 3. And I decided that there were so many tiny little details that it was hard to weave in that I wanted to put something on the website for fun. So there's this page on my website that says for fun, and it's a Nellie Bly quiz. It's 20 questions, it's all multiple choice, and it's all about these crazy things. And there's an answer key at the bottom of it, and you can kind of test yourself. There's like 3 groups that you fall into. You're either like you need to bone up on your Nellie Bly, or you're a Nellie Bly aficionado, or you're like a Nellie Bly expert or whatever. And I just thought it would maybe be something fun to mention to the readers, especially for nonfiction aficionados if they're not too much into fiction. This quiz is all real stuff that happened to her that are just really interesting.
How did you first meet her? Walk us through your journey from first discovering there's this woman who calls herself by the name Nellie Bly, and then you decide you're going to turn this real-life trailblazer into the fictional heroine of your very first novel.
So back, gosh, I think it was probably in 2014, I was reading online and I landed on this blog post about, quote, badass historical women. And Nellie Bly was one of the women mentioned. And it was just maybe like a paragraph or 2, but it went into how, for the sake of a newspaper story, this woman, Nellie, faked insanity and went inside a madhouse for 10 days. And I was like, what? I don't even think I read the rest of the blog. I said, you've got to be kidding me. This can't be real. And I don't know what was more bizarre, the fact that someone had really done this or that I'd never heard of it or her before. So I went to Wikipedia, and sure enough, there she was. Nellie Bly was really Elizabeth Cochrane, and she was one of the first females to blaze a trail for women in journalism. So I then found her own story of what happened called 10 Days in a Madhouse, which was in book form. It's still in print today, by the way, if you can believe that. It was the exact reprint of her 2 installments that she wrote for the New York World back in 1887. And it was fascinating. But because it was written for a newspaper, there really wasn't anything personal in it about her. So I had a lot of questions. Who was she really? Why in the world did she do this? Why was she so desperate? What kind of person would be this crazy? So I looked for the novel and no one had written one. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, I've got to do this. I've got to write it. And if there were ever any qualms on my part about writing it, after I read an excellent biography on her, the deal was really sealed. There was so much fertile ground there. Now, I do want to say, though, that, this was back in, what did I say, 2014. There have since been a few books about Nellie's asylum stunt that have come out, but I didn't know that at the time. So I started writing and I kept at it. And I'm so glad that I did, because she was truly an amazing woman and a lot more brave than I am.
Well, a lot more brave, I think, than anyone. The efforts that she makes and the things that she endures to get a story. You mentioned the other books that have come out. One is called Damnation Island, Poor, Sick, Mad, and Criminal in 19th Century New York. And that book is by Stacey Horn, who I interviewed about it. She told me she's a huge Nellie fan, and she was excited when I told her about A Feigned Madness. And she asked me to put to you this question: where did Tanya find the best stories about what went on at the lunatic asylum, and which one haunts you the most?
Oh, gosh. I don't think there was anything about the Blackwell's asylum that wasn't haunting in some way. Clearly, this was not a happy place. I think the best stories came from Nellie herself, because she was a primary witness to what was going on, and you just can't get a better source than that. There was one line, though, and she doesn't go into it very much, but it gave me the chills as a setup. I think she's going into the dining hall. She's on her way to the dining hall with a group of fellow inmates. And she says that she hears the wail of a baby below stairs. And she wonders, my God, are there newborns here? And right there, the scope of Blackwell's became broader and even more horrible to me. Because all of a sudden, it wasn't just about the unfortunate women who were there, but about children who were probably born there. And, I don't think that they would have been there long. It wasn't like they would have provided a nursery or anything for them. But it did make me wonder, what became of those babies? Were they placed with the members of the family? Were they adopted? That really got me.
Yeah, and it doesn't make it much better even if they weren't there that long, or at least it makes it a different kind of horror, because then you have some poor mother who's just had her child taken away from her and sent
Right.
God knows where. And there, at one point, they discover a woman. This was in Stacey Horn's book. They had those cages. I forget exactly what they
Yes.
called them, right? But they're basically in a bed enclosed in a cage. It's about 6 feet long. You can't sit up in it. Sort of a crib with a cover on, only not as tall and even less room than a crib for an adult, if you can imagine. And they stick a woman in there who's pregnant and leave her there and forget about her. And she ends up
I
giving
know.
birth, right, in those horrible conditions.
Yeah.
This is the kind of thing that was going on. And you wonder what twisted mind thinks of it. And yet, these were supposedly reasonable people with some sort of degrees sometimes, although that's doctors and such things are not very well regulated there. And if they get any kind of experience, they end up leaving Blackwell's for a job that's not so horrifying. And I played that clip at the top in the introduction from The Snake Pit because that's the kind of thinking that it was. It's very much like when you're a child, right? And you have these crazy notions usually about things like, well, if we just take the wheels off of the car, then we can roll it right on the train tracks or something like
Yeah.
that, where you think if we throw somebody in a snake pit and it's so horrible, that would drive a sane person insane. So it would drive an insane person back into sanity. It would make you sane again. And
Right.
the fact that there's never anybody who stops and says, maybe that's a terrible idea. And do you have any kind of scientific data that shows perhaps that would work? It's just,
Right.
hey, let's try it.
Yeah.
It's so far out there that I'm having a hard time even thinking of a logical example of things that you do when you're young. Like you think, well, I'm going to hide. I'll go hide in the dryer and I'll turn it on and no one will ever find me. It's almost, maybe that's the best one yet, but it would be funny if it wasn't real people who are suffering, and it makes you wonder who's mad and who's not.
Right.
Nellie somehow gets the stories and she decides she's going to explore it. And it just is incredible that no one else is going to. What a great place to put her as a fictional character. And you mentioned there about journalism and her breaking into that career for women. You earned a BA in journalism yourself from Indiana University. You didn't know about Nellie's story at the time, but now that you've written the book, what kinship did you find with Nellie and her career when you realized at some point when you're sitting poring over old manuscripts, hey, I'm standing on this woman's shoulder?
So I think sometimes we take for granted the opportunities we have today that didn't exist years ago. I decided on getting a degree in journalism and I didn't think twice about it because there really was never a question of gender bias. But years ago, there were these bold, determined people working really hard to make these things possible, and none of it was easy. This year we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the women's vote. Nellie championed that fight too. I think we've just got to keep these people in the forefront and appreciate what we have now because of the things that they did and what they went through. We've got to make sure that their voices and their stories aren't forgotten.
And historical fiction is a great way to do it. I know that sometimes people get distracted by historical fiction because they're not sure if the events are depicted accurately or if it's just something that's out of your imagination. You mentioned that, and I've seen your author's note and was going to bring that up. You do explain what's real. You give people those primary sources if they want to learn the real story behind your fictional tale. What can you tell readers about how much of your story is based in fact and tempt them that way to join Nellie on this adventure?
So, my storyline follows the record of what happened. Nellie fakes insanity. She stays for 10 days at Blackwell's asylum. It's a harrowing, awful experience. And she does eventually get released. But there were some places where I had to get creative to further illustrate, or I guess you could say embellish a scene or a character, which to me makes the story more vivid. And it could be anything from how a character looked or talked to, the grimness of a scene or whatever. So those are mostly the little things that liven up a story. And I think most readers understand that historical fiction writers do those kind of things. But there were also places where the historical record was really murky to me, or it was really silent. And this is where I think historical fiction writers really have to use their imagination. So, one of the things in this story that may surprise readers, because it's not even on the description on the back of the book, is that this story is in part a love story. It's secondary to the asylum story. This is not a romance novel by any means, but it's there. When I read Nellie's account of what happened, she mentioned a man who comes to see her at the asylum. And just as some quick background, an illustration has been printed of her in the papers, and readers know that there's a girl with amnesia at Blackwell's. So she's been getting these visitors coming in to see if she's their lost daughter or wife or whatever. So she's getting these visitors. Well, in this scene, she describes this man who comes in to see her, and I'm paraphrasing here. She describes him as a gentleman who has known me intimately for years. The sight of me shocked him terribly. This man literally blanches in front of her, and she never mentions his name. And I thought, why? She hadn't been in New York long enough to have known anyone intimately. She's only been there a few months. This made the hairs on the back of my neck go up. And it felt to me as if she deliberately left his name out. She's a reporter and she knew who he was. So why would she do that? So I did some digging back in her days in Pittsburgh, and I realized who she must have been speaking about. Then I see this man's name show up in personal letters Nellie had written that I viewed at Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh. And I'm now certain who this guy is. Even years after her story ran, neither he nor Nellie ever mentioned that he visited her at the asylum. And I figured out why they never did. And I believe that the two of them had a relationship that they never revealed in public. And that's what I put in the story. So this is just an example of how I veered from Nellie's own account. But in this case, I think I've made it more real. So hopefully that's enough temptation for readers to come along for the ride. It's more than just a story about her in the asylum. There were other layers to her that I brought out. And I will say, too, that I'm a big historical fiction reader, and I love it when the author's note at the end of the book tells me where the author has deviated from the story. So in my author's note, you mentioned it's kind of lengthy. I say what's real and what I've imagined, but I also say why I imagined it, because I think it's important to know not only when an author deviates, but why they felt they needed to.
It's worth noting that she leaves this long paper trail, but there are always going to be those frustrating blank spots that you need to then imagine your way into if you're going to make a story or tell the story of her life.
Exactly.
10 Days in a Madhouse is already such a fantastic title and a fantastic story. I know exactly what you mean. You get stuck on those things and say, who was that? For instance, the man who saved young Grover Cleveland. He was in the street playing in Caldwell, New Jersey when he was about 3, which is when he moves out of New Jersey and goes to Buffalo and makes his name and snatches him out of the way from this onrushing cart. And as they say at his birthplace there, he was almost the Grover that never was, and saves his life. And here, this is a little future president of significance. And so you wonder, who are these people that are in your life that had passed through or in your characters' lives? And fortunately for you, you're able to fill that in with your own imagination when she doesn't leave you those things. Because I never thought of that before, that she's writing a lot of this, not just as a journalist, but also conscious of the knock people are going to have against her for being a woman. And they probably wouldn't want to hear about her swooning and about her personal life and things like that. So they try to keep that quiet. You mentioned the author's note, but also I know that you couldn't include all of your research here, and you clearly did a lot of research for Feigned Madness. How did you approach that? How did you develop what I usually call the muscle, where you say, this is a great bit of fact. If I was writing a nonfiction book, this would definitely go in, but I just can't put it in. You have a great website at TanyaMitchellAuthor.com. You have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So I think that's great for authors. They can share some of these facts that are behind their fiction or that they can't even fit into their nonfiction book. But how did you go about that? Because the job of writing a good story and a good plot to keep people is still very much the same.
Right. So I tend to write long in a first draft, and then I have to cut. But in terms of what falls on the cutting room floor and what doesn't, I think this is where beta readers, and I had some early beta readers, and editors are a great help, because sometimes so close to the story. You can't see it from a cherry picker's view. You just can't. You're lost in so many of the details. And in my case, I had been working on it for years. I will say, though, that my editor actually loved the scenes where I take the reader back to a few years before she arrived in New York, when Nellie was still first starting at the Dispatch. The editor, she actually thought more of those scenes should go in because they informed so much of the present day story that was going on in New York at the asylum. So that was a twist I really wasn't expecting. In terms of too much, I also found the New York world and Joseph Pulitzer himself just so fascinating. There was just so much there, but I didn't have the space for it. And it wasn't right to put it in the story. It would have been too much of a distraction. So I really had to rein that in and cut a lot of that.
You mentioned your editor, and Nellie is one of those historical people who prompts people who read about her to say, if you saw that in a book, you wouldn't believe it. And sometimes editors and publishers will say, well, this is too incredible. This couldn't happen. The Mary Sue is a term that I've come across in the last year or two, where just a female character that's just perfect. She has no flaws. And so that makes you not very believable and not very human. And you're just a superhero. This is one of the challenges that Superman faces in the old days, where he's just invulnerable. Nothing can really hurt him. You can hurt the people that he loves, but you can't really hurt him. That's why all those stories, right, are about someone kidnapping poor Lois Lane. She must pack a bag all the time because she's going to get kidnapped, chances are, in the course of any given day. But that's the thing. You don't want to have a character that reads like something out of a comic book and that seems to be magical, because it's not very interesting to read about those sorts of characters. It is when you're a child. You love Superman, right? But after a while, you get to be an adult, and even the cartoons they make now for adults in the Justice League and things, they usually have people who can kick Superman around quite a bit, and it's become the reverse now. Now he's almost a red shirt where, hey, you can show someone beating up Superman, then they must be pretty powerful. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if details of Nellie's real life story, like maybe somebody said, hey, no one's really going to go into a insane asylum that sounds this crazy and that is this cruel, but she really did. So when you were pitching the book to agents and then editors were reading it and they were trying to pitch it to publishers when you had it polished, was that ever a challenge that Nellie does have such an unbelievable story?
Not at all. In fact, it was the opposite. The story is just so rich with details that are just made for storytelling. I mean, it really just fell in my lap. It was great in that way. I mean, even now, I could ramble off things to you that happened to her over the course of her life, and you would be hard pressed to believe them, honestly. For instance, there was once a warrant out for her arrest. Who knew? She was pen pals with a man on death row. She was, and he actually left her some of his things. She married a millionaire 40 years her senior who was so jealous he had her followed the first year of their marriage. I mean, it's almost like you just can't make this stuff up. The asylum story really was the tip of the iceberg. She was really just getting started, and she was only 23.
Yeah, amazing. 23 years old. 23-year-olds today, you think it's still the prime of your life. You're still almost in childhood. You maybe have a TikTok account, and that's the most stressful thing in your life, right? Or any of us. I mean, I'm not saying that at my age I'm running around and getting myself into horrible conditions either, but just the fact that a 23-year-old woman of any era, but especially in this Gilded Age era, when she could have very easily chosen a soft path, was going to sacrifice herself in 10 days of her life in
a veritable hell.
Literally almost, in hell. Yeah, literally in hell. With the idea that she would do that and go into something like the snake pit. And what always gets me is that she does it for other people. It's not just for herself. And that's something that you weave very well here into A Feigned Madness, that she wants to be able to stand up for people, but she realizes that she can't because she doesn't want to blow her cover, and she wants to experience as much as she can so that she can really expose them.
Yeah. And she's almost perched on the edge of a knife in that way, because if she helps people, which is her natural inclination, she could lose everything and never be a reporter in New York. And so she's constantly dealing with, how much do I say? How much do I intervene? Versus, well, if I don't intervene, then how am I helping them at all? So that was an important part I really wanted to get across, because she really did feel that way.
And lots of time just to sit there and be shivering and broken down. And she describes at one point, and this isn't even in your book, I'm not quoting from your book, I don't read the entire novel because I don't want to give away the end, so it may be in there, but she gives that description of being cold and they hose you off with ice cold water, and then they sit you in a room and you're freezing and you have no clothes and you're just so miserable. And she describes this, and then she says, what sane person put through this 12 hours a day and tormented and then not fed and then picked on by other inmates and then yelled at and hit by guards would remain sane? This is not a way to make people
Right.
sane or to treat people. And it's also not necessarily that all of these people, we think of crazy and we think of people pushing another person in front of the subway, let's say, or something like that, or stabbing somebody because you think that you're Napoleon and they've stolen your throne. This is not the people going there that you would
Right.
identify as crazy. It's more like what we see in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yep.
There's a lot of people that are just caught up in that because they're on the line. And hey, you don't speak the language. Hey, you're poor. Hey, you stumble into a policeman. You're sent off to Blackwell's. It's a factory of misery. And then good luck getting out. Good luck even finding out the person is there.
Right.
You're totally at their mercy.
That's right. There were a number of women when Nellie was there that admitted that the reason that they were there was because they had become inconvenient to their husbands. Their husband had found another woman, was having an affair, and didn't want the wife around anymore. So he could just drop her off at the asylum. And it's just, you just shake your head and think, how could this have really gone on? You know, how could this have ever been okay?
It's really a stunning historical story. And I like when you use a novel to give people a little bit of a gateway, a little bit of a hook into reading about the real history, because that woman there in that cage giving birth, whoever that baby was that Nellie hears crying, they had real lives, and hopefully they were long and hopefully they got past this. But it's such a dark period. And it's a reminder too, as I discussed with Stacey Horn, that we have to keep an eye on how we treat people that are very vulnerable, that can't help themselves, that we just turn them over to you and say, oh, okay, we'll just get them out of sight and out of mind. Because that kind of power and hold over people, there's nothing stopping them, literally nothing, until she goes in there in her case and decides she's going to expose them and say to everybody in New York, this is a shame on all of us because we're just ignoring this island sitting there in plain sight in the East River, and we're just sending people there. And like when you tell kids that you sent the dog to live up on a farm in upstate, and everybody that farm would, Bobby Bacala says in The Sopranos, that all the parents tell their kids about the same farm. He says that there can't be all those dogs there. The dog poop would be 10 feet high. And but that's what we tell them about human beings, never mind dogs. I mean, sometimes you have to tell somebody that because dogs don't live that long. You want to cushion the blow for the kids. But some of this is very sadistic, or as you said, human beings just becoming inconvenient. And so let's just ship them off there. That's an incredible story.
Yeah, it really is. They were just the marginalized, and they had no voice, unfortunately.
Until Nellie Bly comes along and gives them a voice. So this is the important thing, and we're going to hear a little bit of her voice, so to speak, right now, because I'm going to ask you to read a little bit, read us a passage from A Feigned Madness, set it up for us, and have at it so we can get a little taste for your writing and also for what you enjoy out of the book, what you think is important.
Okay. I'm glad you talked about the cold water and how cold it was there. In this scene, Nellie has recently arrived at the asylum, and it's time for her and the women of her hall to take a bath. Nurse Group cleared her throat, a challenge in her eyes as they locked with mine. I said naked. Never in my life had I been naked in front of strangers. It was unthinkable I was expected to be now. 40 inmates looked down at the floor, too frightened to meet the nurse's eyes. All but me were stripped bare. We stood in 4 rows of 10 before a small tub, motionless, dispirited, and so chilled to the bone it might have been deep winter and not September. Crouched on a low stool beside the tub was an old, shriveled crone with a rag in her hands, a dingy towel slung on a chair next to her. Low evening light filtering through the barred windows, through diagonal slats across tile that had once been white, but was now gray and bore the scars of perpetual use. Yet in that miserable gray-white room, where there was only the single tub, the rows of sinks and toilets, and the ubiquitous tile, I thought those marks signaled something else. If one were to move one's fingers across those nicks and cracks and fissures like Braille, they would tell the story of women who had borne witness to more than just bathing. They'd endured the crushing weight of hopelessness. A muscle twitched in Nurse Group's jaw. Her pointy chin jutted in contempt. For the last time, remove your clothes, or I will strip you myself.
Readers can hear that you use the first person, which is something that I thought was noteworthy. That draws you into it in the right situation. Other times I like multiple viewpoints, but here you're in her mind, so it puts you in that situation, and it's already uncomfortable to think about. And I think we're much more comfortable being naked maybe in front of strangers, not that we're all running around at nudist colonies, but it doesn't seem so horrible. You think of a gym, you think of something controlled. What I like about that passage is we get inside the mindset where we're not thinking, oh, we're in a hospital. We're in something we can relate to. It's something that hopefully most of us cannot relate to, even people who have been in prison. Today, there's more safeguards, you would hope, on the vast majority of people than there are in a situation like that. But part of the challenge of writing in the first person voice of a real human being like Nellie is you want to get her voice right. You clearly care about her historical legacy, about her as a person and a historical figure. You have people like Stacey Horn who know her well from writing Damnation Island and many other fans of Nellie out there. Was it hard to get her voice right when you were going to write an entire book in her speech? Or did you find after reading so much about her, eventually she became a strong voice in your head and you knew what she would say or do in a given situation?
It's interesting that you asked that because initially I wrote the novel in third person. I tend to prefer third person when I read over first person. And plus, there were scenes where Nellie wasn't going to be in. She just wasn't going to be part of it. And so third person just made sense to me. And then my editor suggested first person as a way to get even deeper inside her head. And after that, it was like I never looked back. It was definitely the way to go. The other thing that I would say about Nellie Bly was that she was a very honest, forthright person. She was very seldom subtle about things. And so knowing her feelings and her motivations wasn't that hard. You kind of got what you saw. She always, wore her heart on her sleeve. So in that sense, getting her voice right wasn't something I struggled with too much.
You're enjoying my conversation with Tanya Mitchell, who brings us A Feigned Madness. It's a novel featuring the intrepid real-life reporter who called herself by the pen name Nellie Bly. You can visit TanyaMitchellAuthor.com for more on today's guest or follow her at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Best-selling author Nicole Evelina writes of the novel, a page-turning thrill ride through an often overlooked historical atrocity. A Feigned Madness vividly recounts the horrors of Blackwell's Island and the mistreatment of its inmates. As a reader, I could really feel Nellie Bly's tenacious thirst to see them have justice. Tanya, all of what Nicole Evelina says in that review is true about just how horrible the conditions were at Blackwell's Island. Part of the challenge that presents a novelist is if this book is just an endless string of horrible, horrible stories and dark and negative things and misery, people are going to not be entertained. They're going to get bogged down in those things, and maybe they'll put down A Feigned Madness and never pick it up again. As with your research, you have to have a light touch where the story is moving forward, and a little bit like Nellie, you can't stop and dwell on each individual case of cruelty or neglect or misery or pain. You have to keep your story going so that you can reach your ultimate goal. So how did you do that? How do you meet that challenge?
So I hope that a lot of those scenes are illuminating because they're such eye openers into how differently patients were treated over 100 years ago. Nellie refers to the women there more often as inmates than she does patients, just to give you an idea of what the culture was like at the asylum. But beyond that, though, there are really two timelines in the story. The current one, or the present one, in which Nellie is at the asylum going through her ordeal, and an earlier one a few years before that's told in flashback. I was able to break up some of those more grisly scenes at the asylum in the current timeline by skipping over to the flashback or the former timeline. And I really didn't want to interrupt the tension of those asylum scenes so much as I wanted to add details from the earlier time that would shed light on what's happening as to why Nellie's thinking and behaving the way she is at the asylum, if that makes sense. And I heard from a few early beta readers and in some more recent reviews that they like those flashback scenes away from the asylum as much as they like the asylum ones. One reviewer said that the added backstory of her life in no way detracted from the main story, but rather helped frame it. And that's exactly what I was going for.
It's almost like comic relief, or like a different scene would be if you did have multiple viewpoints instead of just the first person viewpoint, where you can go back to a simpler time, and it would be good filmmaking too. And if any filmmakers are listening, a Feigned Madness would be fantastic for that, because it's already exactly what a good filmmaker does with history. They'll keep the key things. You're not going to have something in there that's completely out of character for the person that you're writing about, but does give you a little bit of a break. So you can have a movie like Castaway where it's just Tom Hanks on that island, but you do show some of his previous life. And so even though you keep her in this crucible, it's so important, you still do give us some of the experience that allows the reader to catch their breath and allows us to say, well, now we recognize this world a little bit more. And then you're reminded of that crushing feeling that she's still inside the asylum. She's still on this case.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly what I wanted to do.
You did it. See, it's perfect. I got it. I like when I get what you were trying to do. It's never good when I say something to an author, hey, did you do that? I think I saw something there. And they say, no, actually, but it's cool that you picked it up. But that's okay. You can take different things out of good writing. It speaks. I remember they taught us about that in college when we talked about the poetics. It's okay. You can take different things from different words. It doesn't have to invoke the same thing for every reader, just like great art. In fact, it is great art when you write a great novel. In your bio at TanyaMitchell.com, speaking of your influences and speaking of great novels, you write that you've always been drawn to dark stories. We were just talking about the darkness that could potentially sink this story. And you loved in high school all of these other authors that people will recognize: Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, Agatha Christie, and a personal favorite of mine is on the list, Shirley Jackson. I make it a point to read The Haunting of Hill House every 5 or 10 years or so of my life to find new things in it, new examples. Those are some of your inspirations. Authors often cringe, though, when they look back at their early work, because they say, gosh, I was just copying here. I read like really bad Edgar Allan Poe right now, maybe you would say to yourself. Mm-hmm. So you eventually have to find your own distinctive style so that you don't just sound like you're copying your heroes. Since this is your debut novel, it's a great time to ask you about that and about finding that style. How did you make sure that your book was distinct, that you were influenced by all of those giants, but that you weren't copying them?
I think finding the voice was probably the most difficult part of the writing for me. I mean, all of these writers that you mentioned were at the top of their game, and so it's hard to follow them. Part of it was the difficulty in finding voice was because, like you said, this was my first novel. But the other part is that I think voice is hard to define. It's hard to define what it really is, but it's one of those things that you definitely know it when you hear it. And I think when I changed from third person to first person, it was easier for me to mine Nellie's thought patterns and her turns of phrase. And I think the longer I worked at it, the more the cadence of it sort of moved along and felt more and more authentic to me. And at the danger of sounding sappy, I'd like to think if she was looking over my shoulder while I was writing, she'd be very happy with the way I portrayed her, because I got her right.
I almost asked you that too, and then I said, well, I usually don't ask what-if questions, but I found myself thinking the exact same thing, that if she was reading this, she would think to herself, well, that's pretty close. She wouldn't be there with her arms folded, looking at you, typing away at the keys, shaking her head and saying, I would never do that. She would recognize herself in this role.
I wonder how happy she would be, though, that I've unmasked her mysterious man, though. I don't know how she would feel about that. It's been a long, long time, but I wonder. I don't know if she'd be impatiently tapping her foot, like, what are you thinking, writing this in? I don't know. That would be interesting to see what she would think.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to say that she was somebody that didn't give those personal details in the writing because that wasn't the job. And also you mentioned her husband being jealous. So if he was alive, you might be able to get him to pay you for this information, a millionaire such as he was, but that's not going to happen. And I don't think you would sell Nellie out anyway. You clearly have a lot of affection for her, and you're going to stick with her. You have to cover the dialogue in the book. It's from Nellie's point of view, so that makes it easier, but it is a special challenge. The way that people spoke, the way that people think, the names that they had for ethnic groups, the way that they talked about race, not just in specific instances, but just in general. They would say things like the American race and the German race, and thanks in part to the German race, meaning the German nation. Just that term alone is not something we apply. We wouldn't say the Japanese race, for instance, for Japan, despite their equally racist history during that war. So these are things that their terms just don't sync up with modern feelings, and they can make modern readers cringe. And yet you do have Nellie sitting on your shoulder, where you don't want to use a word that she wouldn't use. You're not going to use a term like African American, but you may not want to use another term that she would have used that was considered not an insult at the time. Think of the United Negro College Fund, right? At the time,
Yep.
That's what they named it, but we wouldn't name it that today, right? So it's just things like that I think present a challenge in historical fiction, and I like to ask authors how they deal with that.
So, fortunately for me, Nellie used dialogue in her asylum expose. There wasn't a ton of it, but there was enough. So I didn't have to do too much work to figure out how conversations and turns of phrase might have gone. And those conversations weren't too altogether different than they would have been from today. But I was also careful not to make Nellie someone who got up on her soapbox and spewed about how awful men were and how women were so unfairly treated. So I had to make choices. And so what I did is I showed it by writing scenes that depict her going after stories that she was just dying to write. For instance, some of the tenser scenes in the flashback timeline, this is back in Pittsburgh, are when her editor, George Madden, keeps assigning her stories for the so-called ladies' pages. And themes there were, fashion, hair care, town gossip, maybe some theater. She didn't really like to write those stories. She did a lot of them, but she didn't want to get stuck on those themes because she felt women wanted something with more substance. And she was right, and her readers proved it, because whenever she did a story or a character sketch on, say, the plight of women who worked in Pittsburgh's factories, she did a series of stories about the plight of women who worked in those factories, her fan mail would surge. Women loved those stories. Then, inevitably, Madden, her editor, would put her back on the women's topics, not because she wasn't doing a good job, but because he thought she should be writing about what women should be reading. And so we see Nellie, frustrated, doing the eye roll. She's angry, but she's trying to tamp down on it because this is her employer. So I guess what I'm saying is I tried to show the inherent troubles that she faced in her day being a woman. But I also wanted to show how she worked to get out from under society's expectations of women. And I was very careful not to make her victim in all of this because she was way too strong for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the things I meant to ask about was also the sexism that she faced and how you would deal with that in dialogue, because it's not always a case of just somebody says something to her like, hey, toots, or whatever they might have said. I know that's probably 50 years too late, that reference. But not only is it not somebody speaking to her and you say, I don't like that person, that's fine. You don't like somebody talking to her. You're not supposed to like somebody who's insulting her or talking down to her. But the other challenge is she can't just take it. She can't just be, oh, okay, I'm fine with that, to a modern reader, to somebody who's going to say, well, why isn't she standing up for herself again and again? From her point of view, the fact that she's still trying to prove herself and work within the system and that she's going to do something like this, I think that all solves that potential pitfall for you, because you never see her as a victim. You just said that was your aim. You never feel like, well, why don't you stand up for yourself? Because that's a terrible position to be in as a reader, right, when you want to like somebody, and we should want to like her. She's likable. She's admirable. Maybe that's the word for her. Better than likable, but she's likable too. She's many things. And I think that those are challenges that will pose yourself when you're writing a book about somebody in any period. Even the story, the original Star Trek pilot, Gene Roddenberry put his wife in as the first officer. And it was women that wrote and said, well, who does she think she is? Why is she there? That's silly. Why would you have a woman be the first officer? And
Oh my
people in
goodness.
general, people in general just weren't ready for it. And that was who objected to it. And so those are all challenges that come out. And you're fortunate that you were saying you have some good people that'll read it and give you opinions and look at it from the outside, if you're obviously going to be very close to the story. So I thought that was well handled, that we never feel like she should just stand up for herself, because you can't do it. Within the system, she has to work to change it, and she does change it, and you're one of the people that stands on her shoulders. And I think that's a great way to look at it. She had to do what she could, where she was, with what she had, which is a motto of Theodore Roosevelt's.
She also said in print more than one time that she actually liked men. She preferred to be in the company of men versus women sometimes because she felt them more easy to read and not as coquettish and just more straightforward. So she was not a man hater in any way. She just wanted to be treated fairly. She was all about working for whatever she was asking for. She didn't want anything to be given to her on a silver platter, but she wanted the opportunity to try. It just speaks again to more of her character.
Oh, New York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
I chose the song New York Ain't New York Anymore as the theme song for the History Author Show. It's from 1925, so quite a bit after the 1887 city that we visit in A Feigned Madness, but a song with a sentiment that applies to any age and any time in New York City, going all the way back to the original inhabitants of Manhattan Island. What remains of Blackwell's Island and the wider New York City of Nellie Bly's era that readers can enjoy today if they want to follow your heroine's footsteps?
Well, fortunately, Blackwell's Island has had a major facelift since Nellie's day. The buildings that made up Blackwell's in the 1880s, the penitentiary, the workhouse, the charity hospital, the women's asylum, continued on after she was there for decades. But one by one, they eventually all shut down. I think the asylum closed in 1901, and the last building to go was the hospital, which I think it closed in 1957. So by the 1950s, the island was virtually abandoned. And then it sort of got this colossal rebranding because it was renamed Franklin D. Roosevelt Island in the early 70s, which I have to believe was a way to try and bury this old name and all the horrible memories of a place that had become so synonymous with human misery. So today, it's largely a residential community with excellent views of Manhattan. As far as the asylum goes, it's pretty much long gone, but fortunately, the original octagon tower that separated the wings still stands, and it's still being used today. And the old lighthouse at the northern tip is also still there. And one of the things that I really enjoyed when my husband and I went there for research was that there is this spectacular tramway that departs from Manhattan that will take you directly over the East River and onto the island. I highly recommend that. The view was spectacular. You have this bird's eye view of the island as you're coming in and another of Manhattan on the way back.
I used to work right next door to that at the Animal Medical Center, and it is really a great view. And people have probably seen it, listeners, in the Spider-Man movies, if you've seen those. It's a great place for Spider-Man to hang out.
That's right. One of the things happening recently, though, that I'm so excited about is that when I went there for research, I looked for something about Nellie because I recognized the Octagon Tower. And there was a plaque there that said what it had been used for, but there wasn't a single mention of her and how she had pioneered this story that blew the roof off what was happening at the asylum. There was nothing. So I've heard and I've seen online that the Roosevelt Island Commission is working on a Nellie Bly memorial to be built on the island near the lighthouse to the north. There's room for it there. It's kind of a little park area. And it's supposedly going to showcase Nellie and some of the women she interviewed during her career. And I just can't wait to see it. It's so time that she got her due. There wasn't anything that commemorated her when I visited there. So it's time. It's definitely been time. What I don't know is if with the pandemic and COVID-19, if any of the construction and the planning that they're doing for it has been delayed or not. But it's supposedly supposed to be around the end of the year when it's supposed to be finished.
Well, she's waited almost a century and a half, so I guess a few more years. Hopefully, it won't take that long, but she can
Hope
wait a few
not.
more months. Yeah, and it's so interesting that you say that about the island falling into disrepair, and that it did change so much that it doesn't have that identity. It does, I guess, for the people in any given era. Now, Roosevelt Island, we think of it, and we, at least in the city, and we think of it as being a specific place. It has kind of an identity. Think of Grandpa Al Lewis wandering around there when he was with us, kind of the unofficial mayor of the town from the Munsters. But it was Hog Island originally, before it was Blackwell's. Then in between, today being Roosevelt Island, since 1973, it was Welfare Island, which I guess also had a negative connotation after a
Right.
while. So, but it's just as changing as the city. That idea of New York ain't New York anymore. Everybody's city changes. Esther Crane of Ephemeral New York, that great website of old things in New York, old and forgotten New York. Stacey Horn. Also, we still insist on referring to it as Blackwell's Island, which is just something we picked, right? We could have just settled on the Welfare Island period or the Hog Island period. But when you have those memories of a place and you call it by those names, it reminds you of just how much a city changes, but also how New York does have people who care about the past and hold on to it for things like Nellie Bly, that there's enough people out there who really were inspired by her story. And you, as you did here in A Feigned Madness, want to share her story, want to remind everybody that she was alive and she helped make the city better, her city better. And now it's our job too, not to just go look at the plaque or read A Feigned Madness or something like Stacey Horn's book, Damnation Island, but it's on all of us then to do what we can to make this a better island, because someday they're going to look back at us and say, what were you thinking on some things too? So let's try to be worthy of a plaque, right?
Right. Yeah, something people are proud of they did, instead of, oh my God, is that how it was back then?
Yeah.
You know?
Adds to the story. I went through that with Stacey Horn. I said, I never want to condescend to people in the past, because there's plenty of things that we can also fix ourselves, not to puff ourselves up.
People in the future will be condescending to us, right? Like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me that they really did that back then. But here we are.
Yeah. And so that's exactly what's going to happen. And Nellie did what she could to make her city better. She didn't wait. She didn't throw her hands up. She blew the lid off these horrors at Blackwell's Island. Another blank spot in the historical record is we don't really know where the story came from. You would think that Joseph Pulitzer's World, a name we still hear and know today, that this would be well documented, that they would have been out telling the story, that at the very least a lot of people would have been taking credit for this because this expose is so successful. But it's murky in the historical record. So how did you go about filling in those blanks? Did you do pretty much the same thing where you did a little research, took it as far as you could, and then you just went with what felt right, a compilation of the historical facts you could nail down?
Well, let me just set it up, and then I'll kind of go into what I decided to do. So the day that Nellie goes into the World office after she's lost her purse, she brings in a list of story ideas with her. She knows she's got one shot left to get a job at the biggest newspaper in a city of big papers. And so she makes a list of salacious stories that she's willing to investigate if the editor will just hire her. So we know from their conversation that every idea required some form of subterfuge, where she's pretending to be someone she isn't for the sake of going undercover to get a good story. And the editor gives her $25 and tells her to come back in a week so he can kind of ruminate about it and think it over. I think he probably went to Pulitzer and they had a discussion. But unfortunately, the list that she originally brought in hasn't survived. And it's really a toss-up where the idea came from. The editor who met with her, his name was John Cockrell. He was the managing editor, had a lot of power at the paper. He got the credit first, like right out of the gate. A few years later, there's a biography on Nellie that gave Joseph Pulitzer, the owner of the World, the credit. But then Nellie says, always through all of this, that the idea was one of those on her list that she herself put together. So I'm sitting there going, okay, who really could have done this? And what I decided to do was sort of like a three-way tie. I wanted to give all of them a little bit of credit. So in the book, it's Nellie's original idea, and I truly believe that it was. But Cockrell, because he was a little bit dodgy of a character, I think he was kind of a user. I don't know that he really believed that she could really pull this off. So I have him giving her story a twist. And so instead of Nellie impersonating a lunatic, she had come forward with maybe impersonating a nurse instead. But Cockrell wants to give it that twist. No, I want you to be a lunatic. And then Pulitzer gives it the ultimate blessing. So like I said, it was kind of a three-way tie. Again, I don't think we'll ever really know, but I decided to give them equal billing. So I hope it's believable.
Well, I think it's very believable, especially having worked in newsrooms where you know that maybe it was the fact that everybody added a little bit to it. And she wasn't thinking at the time that, well, let me write this down so that this author, Tanya Mitchell, in 2020 can make sure that she gets exactly the right details. She had so many bigger things to worry about. This is not
right.
This is not a little light story where she's thinking about writing her memoirs. This is so serious at the time. I imagine that you have nightmares knowing a little bit about what's going on in there, and then going in and wanting to find out what happened and then spread the word about it and not forget the people that were in there. So I find that something that's noteworthy about history too, where when you're in the middle of it, you're not writing down everything that happened. You're just trying to focus on the big pictures. And here you are in your leisure, right? Sitting in your antique chair that I happen to know that you have in your office. And you're able to leisurely say, well, why didn't she tell me what color those blinds were on the building? And she's saying, hey, I'm shivering and fighting for my life here, future lady. Leave me alone.
And let me just also add that this conversation that they're having when she comes back and he tells her, no, I want you to impersonate a lunatic. And she says, well, I'll have to feign insanity. How are you going to get me out? And you know what he says? The first words out of his mouth are, I don't know. He really said that. He said, I don't know.
Gosh.
I don't know, but your job is to get in. And so, again, it's just unbelievable that she was willing to do all that. And she did do it, but she did it as a freelancer. He didn't agree to put her on the staff because she was going to do the story. He said, I might think about it and pay you freelance for it because I just want to see what you can do. I just want to see that you can pull this off. So not only is she going in and she knows that he doesn't even know how he's going to get her out, but she doesn't even know if she's going to end up with a job at the end of all of this.
It's really amazing to me, and I'm glad you mentioned that detail, because here she's going in there, and what if he gets hit by a streetcar, which happened all the times in New York City? I always wonder that when I hear Nellie Bly. I say, okay, I'm sending myself in, and it's not as if they're going to show up with the police at the end of the 10 days and get her out. It's not as if she has a safe word or a secret telephone number that she can call or a little Batman tracking device that's on her shirt that she pushes it and she can get out of there. Nobody knows that she's there.
Right. And Cockrell was shifty. He was a shifty guy.
He could have just forgotten about it. Look, people are sending their own wives there to dump him off.
Right.
So,
or he's going to change his mind. Like, nah, not so much. I decided I don't want Nellie to do it anymore. And then she's stuck there forever. How horrible.
Yeah, put his byline on her work and have stolen it. It's just such a thin wire. Look, we're getting tense right now. Just talking about how stressful this is, this crucible that she's in, this thin thread that she's hanging by. And that's what you get in a Feigned Madness. It's already an amazing story. So it just laid itself in your lap and she said, come tell my story. I'm glad you did.
I'm glad that I did too. It's definitely worth a ride.
It's that time when I wrap up the interview. As I guess you can tell, we could speak for some time on this. It's really a lot of fun, if fun is the right word for a story. It is fun, and it should be fun, even though there's some serious things going on under there. You walk that line really perfectly between honoring the real life people that came before us, but also giving us a read that will be entertaining for us and maybe make people want to go and read the real history next. A book's strongest advocate should always be its author. I think you're a very strong advocate for your book, which is good to see. I don't like it when somebody writes a great book and then I talk to them or try to talk to them and they're just really not interested. And so it's not somebody that I will book, frankly, because I want them to be the biggest advocate. I don't want to be more passionate about the book than they are. And Nellie deserved a passionate author. She got it right here in you, Tanya Mitchell. So I know from your social media presence and website and of the quality of A Feigned Madness itself, I know from that this really was a labor of love. We could hear the love and respect you have for Nellie Bly in your voice right now. You've written a book that you wanted to read. You looked for it. You mentioned that's one of the ways that you decided to start and put down that first word in the third person. That's now the first person. But why should listeners pick up the book to follow Nellie on this journey? What's your pitch to them?
I think the story has elements readers look for in a book of fiction. The conflict here is a woman who's willing to undergo a dangerous ordeal so she can keep herself afloat financially and show the newsmen of the day that she's serious and that she has what it takes to live in their world. And the backdrop of all of this drama, of all of this tension, is a lunatic asylum where the Victorian notion of treatment, quote unquote, is more about incarceration than it is about rehabilitation. And that's what she's going into. So, right there at the first chapter, you've got questions. How in the world is she going to pull this off? How is she going to feign insanity? How is she going to get on the island? And if she gets there, how is she going to intervene on behalf of the abused inmates? Does she need to intervene? What happens if she does? Will she blow her cover? Then what happens? And all of those questions early on, that's exactly the kind of tension that you look for as an author. And I hope it's as irresistible to readers as it was to me.
Well, it was irresistible for me when you first sent me A Feigned Madness. You hooked me with the words Nellie Bly, and I decided I would open it up and check it out. And when I did, your fictionalized adventure of her life really delivered what I hoped for in reading a novel. You put it exactly right. This is what a reader looks for. So I wish you the best of luck with A Feigned Madness. And I hope that we'll see Nellie again soon. I haven't asked you about it because I want to keep the hope in my own mind that maybe under your skilled pen, we'll again see Nellie on an adventure in a future book from you.
Thank you.
Well, have a great day. Thanks again for sharing your time and the book with me and everybody listening.
Thank you so much for spending the hour with me.
Again, the novel is A Feigned Madness. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at historyauthor.com on the page for this episode. By buying the book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. Thanks to Tanya Mitchell for joining us and for bringing the legendary Nellie Bly to life through her fiction. Visit TanyaMitchellAuthor.com for more on today's guest, or find her at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. While you're at it, let us know what you think of the book and the interview on Twitter at HistoryDean, Instagram at The History Author Show, or Facebook.com/HistoryAuthor. And if you want to read more about Nellie Bly, I have to give another plug to Stacey Horn. Her book is Damnation Island: Poor, Sick, Mad, and Criminal in 19th Century New York. You can find our conversation about that book in our archives for more fact behind the fiction. That's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio. And if you're an iTunes subscriber, please take a minute to leave us a review. Until our next trip into the past together, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes